bell above the diner door rang 3 times in a row, sharp and fast, and Mara Ellison felt her stomach tighten before she even looked up. It was not the sound of hungry travelers stopping for pie. It was the sound of people who did not want to be noticed, trying very hard to look normal. She was wiping down the counter at Grady's Diner, the only place open past 9 in the small town of Ashwood Falls, when 6 men walked in within the space of 2 minutes. They did not walk in together. They did not look at each other. But Mara had worked nights long enough to know that strangers who pretend not to know each other often know each other very well. The first man took the booth by the window. The second sat near the register. 2 more moved toward the back, close to the emergency exit, as if they wanted a clear path out. And then came the last 2, walking slower, more careful, flanking a man who moved like he owned the room without ever raising his voice. Mara did not know his name yet. She only knew that when he stepped inside, the air in the diner seemed to shift, the way it does right before a storm rolls over open fields. The other 5 men in the room adjusted themselves around him without being told to, the way a shadow adjusts around a lamp. She grabbed her notepad and walked toward their booth, because that was her job, and because curiosity was pulling her feet forward even faster than duty. "Evening," she said, keeping her voice light. "Can I start you off with something to drink?" The man in the center looked up at her. His eyes were a deep, steady brown, calm, in a way that made her feel like he was reading every detail of her face in under 2 seconds. He had the kind of presence that made the booth feel smaller. "Black coffee," he said. "No sugar." "Same," said the man to his left. The third man, older, with gray at his temples, asked for tea instead, and Mara noted it down, glancing briefly at the 2 men seated near the back exit. They had not ordered yet. They were watching the door. She moved to the counter to prepare the drinks, and it was there, pouring coffee into white ceramic cups, that she first heard it. A voice, low, from the booth near the window. The man who had walked in first, speaking to no one in particular, as if rehearsing a line to himself. "Make sure his coffee gets the usual sugar." Mara froze for half a second, cup in hand. She had just taken his order herself. He asked for no sugar. She had written it down. There was no reason for anyone to mention sugar, unless they meant something else by it. She told herself she had misheard. The diner was noisy tonight, with the hum of the refrigerator and the low murmur of a television mounted near the kitchen. Maybe he was talking about someone else's coffee, another table, another night entirely. She carried the tray back toward the booth, setting the cups down carefully. Black coffee for the man in the center, black coffee for the man on his left, and tea for the older man. As she placed the last cup down, she caught the eye of the man near the window, the one who had spoken the strange words. He smiled at her, polite and empty, the kind of smile people give when they want to be forgotten the moment you look away. She smiled back, out of habit, and walked away, but something in her chest refused to settle. Mara had grown up around people who noticed things others missed. Her Uncle Peter had spent years working as a tracker for one of the northern packs, back before he retired and moved to Ashwood Falls to live a quiet life near his sister. He used to tell her stories at the kitchen table when she was young. He told her that the most dangerous people in any room were never the ones shouting. They were the ones speaking in code, using ordinary words to hide something sharp underneath. "The world is full of quiet signals, Mara," he used to say. A word for sugar might mean poison. A word for rain might mean run. If something feels wrong, trust that feeling before you trust your own doubts. She had laughed at him back then, thinking his years around dangerous work had made him see shadows everywhere. But standing behind the counter now, watching the man near the window sip his water without ever ordering food, she found herself thinking about those stories in a different light. She busied herself with other tables, refilling water glasses, taking an order from an elderly couple near the door, but her eyes kept drifting back to the booth by the window. She noticed the 2 men near the emergency exit had still not ordered anything. She noticed the older man with gray hair kept glancing toward the door every few seconds, as if counting exits instead of enjoying his tea. Most of all, she noticed the man in the center of it all, the one everyone else seemed to orbit around. He drank his coffee slowly, unaware, talking quietly to the man beside him, about something that sounded like territory boundaries and upcoming meetings. His voice was calm. His shoulders were relaxed. He trusted the room around him completely, the way someone trusts a room they believe has already been checked and cleared. Mara wiped down an empty table near the counter, positioning herself where she could watch without seeming to watch. She saw the man near the window reach into his jacket pocket and check something small, cupped in his palm, before slipping it away again. She could not see what it was. She only saw the quick, practiced motion of someone who did not want to be noticed doing it. Her hands were trembling slightly as she gathered a stack of used napkins from a nearby table. She told herself again that she was imagining things, that she was a waitress in a small-town diner, and not a detective, that these men were probably just careful business travelers discussing a private deal, nothing more. But then she remembered the phrase, the usual sugar, spoken about a man who had specifically asked for none. She thought about walking away and pretending she had never heard it. It would be easy. She could finish her shift, go home, sleep, and never think about strangers in a diner booth again. Whatever this was, it was clearly bigger than her, more dangerous than anything she understood, and getting involved could put her in the middle of something she had no way of controlling. She glanced at the clock above the kitchen window. 9:42. Her shift would not end for another 2 hours. The bell above the door rang again, and a new group walked in, 4 teenagers laughing loudly about something on one of their phones. Mara used the noise as cover to walk closer to the booth by the window, pretending to check if the salt and pepper shakers needed refilling at the table beside it. Up close, she could see the man's hands better. He held his phone loosely, thumb moving over the screen without actually typing anything, a nervous habit rather than real communication. His eyes kept flicking toward the center booth, toward the man drinking his coffee, then back down to his phone, then toward the 2 men near the exit. He was waiting for something. She was almost certain of it now. She returned to the counter, pulse quickening, and busied her hands with drying a stack of mugs that did not need drying. Her manager, an older man named Oliver who ran the night shift with quiet efficiency, noticed her unusual focus and asked if everything was fine. "Just tired," she said, forcing a small smile. "Long night." Oliver nodded and returned to the kitchen, leaving Mara alone with her racing thoughts. She looked again toward the center booth. The man was reaching for his coffee cup, lifting it slightly, about to take another sip. Something about the casual, trusting way he held the cup made her chest tighten painfully. If she was wrong, she would embarrass herself in front of strangers and possibly lose her job for making an unfounded accusation. If she was right and said nothing, something terrible might happen in the middle of her own diner, and she would carry that silence for the rest of her life. She thought of her Uncle Peter again, his voice steady across the kitchen table years ago. Trust the feeling before you trust your doubts. Her feet started moving before she had fully decided to move them, weaving between tables, water pitcher in hand, as an excuse to approach the booth one more time. Her heart pounded so loudly she was surprised no one else could hear it. She reached the booth just as the man lifted the cup closer to his lips, and every instinct in her body told her that if she did not speak now, she might never get another chance. "Can I get you anything else?" she asked, voice steadier than she felt, buying herself one more second to decide. The man paused, cup still raised, and looked at her with mild curiosity. "We're fine, thank you." She glanced quickly toward the man by the window, who was watching the exchange with a stillness that did not match his earlier restless energy. It was the stillness of someone holding their breath, waiting to see what happened next. Mara's mind raced through every possible outcome, every reason to stay quiet, and every reason to speak. She thought about walking away, filling water glasses at another table, letting the moment pass like a wave rolling back out to sea. Instead, she leaned in slightly, lowering her voice so only the men at the booth could hear her, and said the words that would change everything that followed. Words she barely recognized as her own, even as she spoke them, warning the calm, unaware man in front of her that something about his coffee, and the men watching him from across the room, felt very wrong indeed. The moment the words left her mouth, she felt the entire booth shift, as though she had pulled a single thread and the whole room had tightened around it. The man with the calm brown eyes set his coffee cup down slowly, without drinking, and turned his full attention toward her, for the first time since she had approached the table. "What did you say?" he asked quietly, and there was nothing dismissive in his tone now, only a sharp, focused stillness that made Mara's skin prickle with the sense that she had just stepped into something far larger than a simple diner shift on an ordinary Tuesday night. Mara swallowed hard, aware that every man at the booth was now watching her, and aware, too, that the man near the window had gone very still, his phone forgotten in his hand. "Your coffee," she said quietly, choosing her words with care. "You asked for no sugar, and I heard someone say, to make sure you got the usual sugar anyway. I don't know what that means, but it felt wrong, so I thought you should know." The man beside him, the one with sharp eyes and broad shoulders, shifted forward immediately, his hand moving toward the coffee cup, though he did not touch it. "Which table?" he asked, voice low and urgent, though his face stayed carefully blank for anyone watching from a distance. Mara did not turn her head, afraid of drawing attention, but she tilted her chin slightly toward the booth by the window. Him. The man who ordered water and never touched his phone the whole time he's been sitting there. The older man with gray hair, who had been sipping his tea in silence, set his cup down without a sound and rose from his seat with unhurried calm, as though he were simply stretching his legs. He walked toward the counter instead of toward the window booth, passing close enough to glance at Mara. "Thank you," he murmured as he passed. "Go back to the counter now and act as though nothing happened." Mara did as she was told, though her legs felt unsteady beneath her. She walked back to the counter, picked up a rag, and pretended to wipe down a surface that was already clean, watching from the corner of her eye as the diner seemed to rearrange itself around her, without a single loud word being spoken. The man in the center of the booth, the one whose calm presence had filled the room from the moment he walked in, had not moved from his seat, but something in his posture had changed. He was no longer relaxed. His eyes moved slowly across the diner, cataloging every face, every exit, every shadow, the way a man does when he has just been reminded that comfort is never guaranteed. His name, though Mara did not know it yet, was Damien Voss, and he was not simply a businessman meeting associates over coffee. He led the largest alliance of packs in the region, 5 territories bound together under his authority, a position that made him both deeply respected and constantly at risk from those who wished to see the alliance broken apart. Tonight's meeting had been arranged quietly, away from his usual fortified meeting halls, specifically because he wanted a night that felt ordinary, free from the constant weight of formal protection. He had chosen Ashwood Falls because it sat outside any contested territory, a neutral stretch of road where no pack held claim, a place where he believed he could simply be a man having coffee with an old ally. That belief was now unraveling in front of him. His second-in-command, Kellen Ashford, the sharp-eyed man seated beside him, kept his voice low as he leaned closer. "We should move you out through the back." Damien shook his head slightly, jaw tight. "Not yet. If we move too fast, we lose the chance to understand what we're dealing with. Let Elias handle it quietly first." Elias, the older man with gray hair, was already speaking in a hushed tone near the counter to 2 more men who had been stationed outside the diner in a parked car, men Mara had not even noticed arriving. Within moments, those 2 men entered through the front door with the casual, unhurried steps of customers looking for a late-night meal, though their eyes moved with sharp, practiced awareness the second they crossed the threshold. Mara watched the choreography unfold from behind the counter, feeling like she had stepped into a play where everyone but her had memorized their lines. The 2 men who entered split apart smoothly, one drifting toward the back exit, where the earlier suspicious men had been sitting, and one moving toward the front door to block any hurried escape. The man near the window, the one who had spoken about sugar, seemed to sense the shifting tide in the room. He set down his glass of water slowly, his eyes darting first to the door, then to the booth where Damien sat, then finally landing on Mara herself, as though only now realizing that she might be the reason his careful plan had unraveled. Her stomach dropped as their eyes met. For a moment, neither of them moved, the diner around them oblivious, the teenagers still laughing over their phone screens, the elderly couple still quietly finishing their meal, unaware that something dangerous was folding itself closed just a few tables away. Then the man rose from his seat, moving with deliberate calm toward the door, as if simply deciding it was time to leave. Mara's breath caught, unsure whether to call out, to warn someone, or to stay perfectly still and let the men who clearly knew what they were doing handle the situation without her interference. She did not have to decide. The man stationed near the front door stepped smoothly into his path, blocking the exit with the casual ease of someone adjusting his jacket, though the message beneath the gesture was unmistakable. "Leaving so soon?" The man at the door asked pleasantly. "Didn't even finish your water." The man near the window hesitated only a second before turning sharply toward the back exit instead. But the second guard was already there, arms crossed, blocking that path just as effectively. For the first time since he had walked into the diner, the man's calm mask slipped, replaced by something tighter, more alert. The look of someone realizing the room he thought he controlled had quietly been taken from him. Mara's hands gripped the edge of the counter as she watched the standoff unfold, her mind racing through every possible outcome. She glanced toward Damien, who had risen from his seat now, standing tall and composed, despite the tension crackling through the room, his eyes fixed on the man by the window, with an intensity that made Mara's skin prickle. "You've made a mistake," Damien said quietly, his voice carrying easily across the small diner despite its low volume, the kind of voice that did not need to be raised to command a room. "Whoever sent you should have chosen someone more careful." The man near the window said nothing, his jaw tight, his eyes flicking once more toward Mara before returning to Damien. There was no confession in his silence, but there was no denial either, and that silence told its own story clearly enough. Kellen moved quickly, stepping between Damien and the man with a protective instinct that seemed almost automatic, his hand resting near his jacket in a gesture that promised readiness without threat. "We're not here to cause a scene," he said evenly, glancing briefly at the teenagers and the elderly couple, both groups still blissfully unaware of the tension surrounding them. "Walk outside calmly, and we'll discuss this like reasonable people." For a long, tense moment, it seemed the man might refuse, his eyes scanning for any gap in the careful net that had formed around him. But the guards at both exits remained steady, unmoving, and Elias approached from the side with the same quiet authority that had marked his earlier movement across the diner. "There's no version of tonight where you walk out of here free," Elias said calmly. "But there is a version where you walk out of here unharmed. That choice is yours to make." Something in the man's shoulders finally sagged, the fight draining out of him as he seemed to accept that his window for escape had already closed. He allowed himself to be guided toward the door, flanked closely by two guards, his expression unreadable, but his resistance gone. As they passed the counter, the man glanced once more at Mara, his eyes narrowing slightly, though whether from anger or grudging acknowledgement of what she had done, she could not tell. She held his gaze without flinching, surprising even herself with the steadiness she found in that moment. Once the door closed behind them, the diner seemed to exhale collectively, though only Mara, Damien, Kellen, and the departing group truly understood the weight of what had just happened. The teenagers laughed again over something on their screen, oblivious. The elderly couple asked for their check, unaware that danger had just walked past their table and out into the night. Damien remained standing for a long moment, staring at the door, before turning his attention back to the counter, where Mara stood frozen, uncertain what to do now that the immediate danger had passed. His eyes found hers, and for the first time since he had entered the diner, he looked at her not as a waitress refilling water glasses, but as someone whose quiet observation had just changed the course of his evening entirely. "I owe you an explanation," he said quietly, walking toward the counter with unhurried steps, "and considerably more than that." Mara opened her mouth to respond, though she was not entirely sure what words would come out, her mind still catching up to everything that had unfolded in the span of a few short minutes. Before she could speak, Kellen appeared at Damien's side, his expression sharp with lingering concern. "We still don't know what was in that coffee," he said quietly, "or who sent them." Damien's gaze did not leave Mara's face as he answered, "Then let's find out. And let's make sure she's protected while we do." Within minutes, the diner had transformed from a quiet late-night stop into something closer to a controlled operation, though anyone glancing through the front windows would have seen nothing more than a group of people finishing a meal. Damien had a way of directing events without ever seeming to raise his voice, a quality that impressed Mara, even as her nerves remained stretched thin. Kellen carried the untouched coffee cup carefully to a small table near the kitchen, using a clean napkin to avoid touching the rim directly. He pulled a small vial from an inner jacket pocket, the kind of item that seemed oddly out of place for someone dressed like an ordinary businessman, and dipped a thin strip of paper into the liquid. Mara watched from a short distance, arms crossed over her chest, trying to look calmer than she felt. Oliver, her manager, had stepped out back to handle a delivery, leaving her alone at the counter, with strangers, who had just revealed themselves to be far more than they appeared. "What is that?" she finally asked, unable to hold back her curiosity any longer. Kellen glanced up briefly. "A testing strip. It reacts to certain substances that shouldn't be in a drink." The strip began to change color almost immediately, shifting from its original pale shade into a deep, unsettling shade of violet. Kellen's jaw tightened as he studied the result, and beside him, Elias leaned in for a closer look, his expression grim. "Nightshade extract," Elias said quietly. "Refined. Someone spent real effort preparing this." Damien, who had been watching the process with quiet intensity, did not seem surprised so much as grimly satisfied to have his suspicion confirmed. "Enough to affect me?" he asked. "Enough to weaken you significantly within 20 minutes, Kellen answered. "Slow your senses, dull your strength. Not enough to be immediately obvious, but enough to leave you vulnerable to whatever came next." Mara felt a chill move through her at those words, understanding now just how close the evening had come to ending in tragedy. If she had stayed silent, if she had dismissed the strange phrase as nothing more than an odd turn of conversation, Damien would have finished that cup of coffee without a second thought, and whatever plan had been set into motion around him would have unfolded exactly as intended. "How did you know?" Damien asked, turning his full attention back to her, his voice softer now, curious rather than commanding. Mara hesitated, unsure how to explain something that had felt more like instinct than logic. "I heard one of them say something about sugar, right after you asked for none. It didn't make sense, and it stuck with me. My uncle used to say that people who mean harm often speak in code, using ordinary words to hide something else. I don't know why, but once I heard it, I couldn't stop thinking about it." Elias studied her with new interest at the mention of her uncle. "Your uncle, was he perhaps someone who worked closely with a pack?" "He was a tracker," Mara said. "Retired years ago. Peter Ellison. He doesn't talk about it much anymore, but he used to tell me stories when I was young." Elias exchanged a brief glance with Damien, something passing silently between them that Mara could not fully interpret, though she sensed it carried weight beyond simple recognition of a name. "I know that name," Elias said. "He served under the Northern Alliance many years ago, a good tracker. Careful, observant. It seems those instincts passed down to you more than either of you realized." Mara felt an odd swell of pride mixed with disbelief, hearing her uncle's old work spoken of with such respect by strangers, who clearly moved in circles far removed from the quiet diner life she knew. She had always assumed his stories were simply that, stories, colorful memories from a life he had long since left behind. She had never imagined those same instincts would one day save someone's life through her. Outside, in the parking lot, the two men who had been escorted from the diner were being questioned quietly by the guards who had blocked their exit earlier. Kellen excused himself briefly to check on the progress, returning a few minutes later with new information that deepened the concern already settling over the group. "They're not talking easily," Kellen said, "but one of the phones we recovered had a message thread. Coordinates for a rendezvous point about 10 miles from here, timed for later tonight. It looks like whoever hired them wanted a car waiting to move quickly once the job was finished." Damien's expression darkened at this, the calm mask he had worn since standing up from his booth beginning to show cracks of genuine anger beneath it. So this wasn't a rushed attempt. Someone planned this carefully, chose this location specifically because it felt safe. "It gets worse," Kellen added quietly. "The message thread mentions someone called the Second Hand. We don't have a name yet, but it sounds like whoever arranged this has done it before, and successfully." Mara listened to this exchange with growing unease, realizing that she had stumbled into something far larger than a single attempted attack in a small-town diner. This was not a single desperate act, but part of something organized, something with a pattern and a history, something that reached beyond the walls of Ashwood Falls entirely. "What happens now?" she asked quietly, unsure whether the question was even hers to ask. Damien turned to face her fully, his expression softening slightly despite the tension still radiating from the rest of his posture. "Now, we make sure you're protected, because the men outside know your face, and whoever sent them will likely learn what happened here tonight. That makes you a loose thread in their plan, and I won't allow harm to come to you, because of what you did for me." The weight of his words settled heavily over Mara. She had expected gratitude, perhaps a generous tip, and a quiet thank you, before these strangers disappeared back into whatever world they came from. She had not expected to become part of the story herself, tied now to danger she barely understood. "I have work tomorrow," she said, the words feeling absurdly small against the backdrop of everything that had just happened. "I have a life here. I can't just disappear." No one is asking you to disappear, Elias said gently. But some precautions will be necessary, at least until we understand the full scope of what we're dealing with. Kellen's phone buzzed quietly, and he glanced at the screen before speaking again, his voice grave. The car at the rendezvous point just left. Whoever was coordinating this from the outside likely already suspects something went wrong. Damien nodded once, decisive. Then we move quickly, and quietly. Kellen, arrange transport for Miss Ellison. Elias, contact the Alliance and let them know what happened here tonight. We'll need eyes on this before word spreads and creates panic among the other packs. Mara felt her pulse quicken at the mention of transport, uncertain what exactly that meant for her immediate future. Wait, she said, holding up a hand. I appreciate everything, truly, but I need to understand what's happening before I agree to anything. This is my life we're talking about. Damien studied her for a long moment, something like respect flickering behind his calm brown eyes. You're right, he said finally. You deserve honesty, not simply instructions. Let me explain everything, from the beginning, and then you can decide for yourself what you're comfortable with. He gestured toward an empty booth near the back of the diner, away from the windows, and Mara found herself sitting across from the very man whose life she had unknowingly saved less than an hour earlier, ready now to learn exactly what world she had stepped into the moment she chose to speak up instead of staying silent. Damien waited until Kellen and Elias had stepped away to handle their own tasks before he spoke again, his voice quiet enough that only Mara could hear him clearly across the small booth. My name is Damien Voss, he said. I lead an alliance of 5 territories, bound together under one authority, for the sake of peace and stability. It is a position that comes with respect, but also with a great deal of danger, because not everyone wishes to see that alliance remain strong. Mara absorbed this slowly, pieces of the evening rearranging themselves in her mind, now that she understood the full shape of what she had witnessed. So those men tonight, they wanted to weaken you, so someone else could finish the job later. Likely, Damien confirmed. The nightshade extract in the coffee would not have killed me outright. It would have left me vulnerable, slower, easier to overpower or capture without a struggle. Whoever arranged this understood that a public, obvious attack would draw too much attention and resistance. A quiet, gradual weakening was far more effective, and far harder to trace back to its source. And you had no idea, Mara said, more to herself than to him. None of your guards noticed anything wrong, until I said something. Damien's expression carried a trace of something humbling, an acknowledgement that did not come easily to a man used to being the one who protected others, rather than the one who needed protecting. We trusted the location because it sat outside contested territory. We assumed neutral ground meant lower risk. That assumption nearly cost me everything. Mara studied him for a moment, this man who commanded fear and respect from powerful people, sitting across from her in a worn diner booth with a quiet, almost boyish honesty in his voice. It was strange to see someone so clearly powerful speak so plainly about his own near miss. Why me? She asked finally. Why did I notice something your own people missed? Damien considered the question carefully before answering. Perhaps because you had no expectations going into that room. My guards were trained to look for obvious threats, sudden movements, hidden weapons, aggressive posturing. You were simply watching people, the way anyone does when trying to understand a stranger. Sometimes the quietest observation catches what trained eyes overlook, because it isn't looking for danger specifically. It's simply paying attention. Mara thought of her uncle again, his stories returning to her with new clarity now that she understood their weight. He had always told her that people revealed themselves in small, unremarkable moments, long before their true intentions became obvious. She had never imagined those lessons would matter beyond casual curiosity. Kellen returned to the booth then, his expression serious as he addressed Damien directly. We've confirmed the identity of one of the men. Goes by the name Victor Wren. Small-time enforcer, previously connected to disputes on the eastern border. He's talking now, though slowly. What is he saying? Damien asked. He claims he was hired through an intermediary, someone he never met directly. Payment arranged through an untraceable account. He was given the poison already prepared, along with instructions on timing and phrasing. He doesn't know who ultimately ordered the attack. Damien's jaw tightened at this information, frustration flickering across his otherwise composed features. Someone experienced arranged this. Someone who understands how to use hired hands, without exposing themselves directly. Elias joined them a moment later, his expression equally grim. "I've reached out to the Alliance Council. They're aware something happened, though we've kept the details minimal until we understand more. There's already concern that this could be connected to the unrest along the southern border." Mara listened to this exchange, feeling increasingly aware of just how large the situation had grown beyond a simple diner encounter. What had begun as a strange phrase overheard while pouring coffee had unraveled into political tension, stretching across territories she had never even heard mentioned before tonight. "I don't understand all of this," she admitted quietly. "Territories, alliances, borders. I've lived in Ashwood Falls my whole life, and I barely knew any of this world existed beyond the occasional rumor." Damien offered her a small, understanding smile. "Most people live their whole lives without ever needing to understand it. That isn't a flaw, Mara. It's simply the nature of how carefully we keep our world separate from those who don't need to carry its burdens. But I'm carrying it now," she said, "whether I wanted to or not." Damien's expression grew more serious, the weight of responsibility settling visibly over him. "That's precisely why I intend to make sure you're protected. Victor Wren saw your face clearly before he was taken outside. If whoever hired him learns that a witness identified the plan before it could succeed, they may see you as a loose end worth eliminating." The bluntness of his words sent a fresh wave of unease through Mara, the reality of her situation settling heavier than before. She had imagined, perhaps naively, that once the men were taken away, her involvement would end there. A strange story she might tell friends someday, nothing more. "What kind of protection?" she asked carefully. "For now, discretion," Damien said. "We'll ensure someone reliable keeps a quiet watch over your safety, without disrupting your daily life more than necessary. If the situation escalates, we may need to discuss more direct measures, but I won't make that decision without your input." Mara appreciated the respect in his words, the acknowledgement that her life belonged to her, even now that it had become entangled with his. Still, the idea of being watched, of danger lurking somewhere in the shadows because of one moment of honesty, unsettled her deeply. "And my uncle?" she asked suddenly, a new worry surfacing. "If they learn my name, would they go after him too? He's retired, he lives alone." Elias answered this time, his voice calm but firm. "We will ensure his safety is considered as well. Given his history, he may understand the precautions better than most, and may even be willing to advise on how best to protect your household without drawing unwanted attention." Mara nodded slowly, grateful for the assurance, even as new questions continued to surface, faster than she could organize them. The diner around her, still populated by oblivious customers finishing late meals, felt suddenly like a strange, fragile bubble, separating her old ordinary life from whatever came next. Oliver returned from the back room then, glancing curiously at the unusual gathering near the back booth, though years of managing a late-night diner had taught him not to ask too many questions about strange customers who kept to themselves. "Everything all right over here?" he asked cautiously, addressing Mara directly. "Everything's fine," Mara said, forcing calm into her voice, despite the storm still churning beneath her composed exterior. "Just finishing up a conversation." Oliver nodded, though his eyes lingered a moment longer on the unfamiliar men before he returned to the counter, satisfied enough not to press further. Damien watched this small exchange with quiet interest. "You're good at that," he observed. "Keeping your composure, even now." "I've had practice," Mara said, with a faint, humorless smile. "Waiting tables teaches you to smile through almost anything." Kellen, who had been quietly observing the conversation, finally spoke up with a question of his own. "What will you tell your manager about tonight? He'll likely wonder why a group of strangers stayed so long without ordering more food." Mara considered this for a moment. "I'll think of something. A business meeting that ran long, perhaps. It won't be the strangest story this diner has seen." Damien rose from the booth then, signaling that their conversation, at least for tonight, was drawing to a close. "I'll arrange for someone to speak with you again tomorrow, once we understand more about tonight's events. In the meantime, please be careful, and trust your instincts the way you did tonight. They served you, and me, remarkably well." Mara stood as well, feeling suddenly aware of how strange the evening had become, standing across from a man who commanded respect across entire territories, having spent the last hour discussing danger and protection, as though it were simply another Tuesday night conversation. "Thank you," Damien said quietly, his eyes holding hers with a sincerity that felt entirely different from the polite gratitude of an ordinary customer. "You saved my life tonight, Mara Ellison. I won't forget that." As the group prepared to leave, gathering quietly and settling their bill with generous payment despite barely touching their food, Mara found herself watching the door long after it closed behind them, wondering just how much her ordinary life in Ashwood Falls had changed in the span of a single evening shift. The next morning, Mara woke to the sound of her phone buzzing against the nightstand, and for one disoriented moment, she thought the events of the previous night had simply been an unusually vivid dream. Then she saw the message on her screen, a single line from an unknown number, and her stomach dropped all over again. "Good morning, Miss Ellison. This is Elias. Please be cautious today. A car will be parked near your building for your safety. Do not approach it unless needed. We will speak again soon." She set the phone down slowly, staring at the ceiling of her small apartment, as the reality of last night settled fully over her for the first time since waking. It had not been a dream. Somewhere out there, men connected to a dangerous plot now knew her face, and somewhere else, a man who led an alliance of powerful territories had promised to protect her because of one whispered warning over a cup of coffee. She dressed quickly, feeling an unfamiliar prickle of unease as she moved through her usual morning routine, glancing more than once toward her apartment window, half expecting to see something out of place in the quiet street below. When she finally looked, she noticed a plain gray sedan parked a short distance from her building, unremarkable in every way, except for the fact that it had not been there the day before. Her phone buzzed again as she stepped outside. Another message from Elias. "The car belongs to us. Driver's name is Grace. She'll keep a discreet distance unless you need her." Mara glanced toward the car, and through the windshield, she caught a brief glimpse of a woman with short dark hair, perhaps in her 30s, who offered a small, polite nod, before returning her attention to the street ahead. It was oddly comforting, and deeply unsettling all at once, knowing that her ordinary walk to visit her uncle now came with a silent guardian, trailing a careful distance behind. Her uncle Peter lived on the quieter side of town, in a small house, surrounded by an overgrown garden he had never quite found the energy to tame since retiring. Mara found him on the porch, coffee in hand, watching the street with the same careful attentiveness he had carried throughout her childhood, though age had softened the sharpness in his eyes without dulling it entirely. "You look like someone who didn't sleep much," he said, as she approached, setting his cup down on the small table beside his chair. Mara sat across from him, unsure exactly where to begin. "Something happened last night, at the diner." She recounted the evening carefully, watching her uncle's expression shift from casual interest to focused alertness as the details unfolded. The strange phrase about sugar, the coffee laced with poison, the calm efficiency of the men who had handled the situation once she spoke up. When she finished, Peter sat in silence for a long moment, staring out at the quiet street beyond his garden. "Damien Voss," he said finally, almost to himself. "I've heard the name mentioned in passing over the years, though our paths never crossed directly. He leads a significant alliance. If someone targeted him specifically, this wasn't a random act of violence. This was calculated." "That's what they said too," Mara replied. "They mentioned someone called the Second Hand, though they don't have a name yet." Peter's expression darkened at this, a flicker of old memory passing behind his eyes. "The Second Hand. I've heard whispers of that title before, years ago. A person who arranges dangerous work without ever appearing directly involved. Someone who hires hands like the men from last night, and disappears the moment the job is done, or undone. If that title still exists, whoever holds it now is dangerous, patient, and very difficult to trace." Mara felt a chill settle over her, despite the warm morning sun. "They said I might be in danger, because the man who was caught saw my face." Peter reached over and placed a steady hand on her shoulder, the same gesture of quiet reassurance he had offered her many times throughout her life. "Then we take precautions, and we trust the people protecting you, at least for now. But Mara, listen to me carefully. Whoever ordered this attack will want to know exactly how their plan failed. That curiosity alone makes you valuable to them, in ways that could be very dangerous." As if summoned by his words, Mara's phone buzzed once more, and this time the message came from an unfamiliar number entirely, not from Elias or anyone she recognized. "We know what you saw. We know what you said. This isn't finished." Mara's hands trembled as she stared at the screen, the warmth of the morning suddenly feeling distant and cold. She showed the message to her uncle, whose expression hardened instantly into something she rarely saw from him, a sharp, protective focus that reminded her he had once lived a life far more dangerous than his quiet retirement suggested. "Call the number Elias gave you," he said firmly. "Now." Mara's fingers fumbled slightly as she dialed, and Elias answered on the second ring, his voice calm, despite the urgency in her own. "I received a message," she said quickly, reading the threatening text aloud. "From an unknown number." There was a brief pause on the line, followed by the sound of Elias speaking quietly to someone else nearby, before returning his attention to her. "Stay where you are. Grace will come to you immediately. We'll trace the number, though it's likely untraceable, given how carefully this has been handled so far." Within minutes, the gray sedan pulled up outside Peter's small house, and Grace stepped out, her posture alert but composed, scanning the quiet street with practiced awareness before approaching the porch. "Miss Ellison," she said politely, though her eyes carried a seriousness that matched the tension of the morning. "Mr. Voss would like to see you directly, if you're willing. He believes it's safer to discuss next steps in person rather than over the phone." Mara glanced at her uncle, who nodded encouragingly, despite the worry still evident in his expression. "Go," he said. "I'll be fine here, and you need answers more than you need to sit around worrying with me." Reluctantly, Mara agreed, following Grace to the car and settling into the back seat, her mind racing through everything that had unfolded in less than 12 hours. The drive was quiet, Grace focused entirely on the road, occasionally checking the mirrors with the same careful attentiveness Mara had noticed in every member of Damien's circle so far. They arrived at a modest, unassuming building on the edge of town, nothing like the fortified strongholds Mara might have imagined for someone of Damien's position. Inside, the space was simple but clearly secure, quiet hallways leading to a private meeting room, where Damien waited, along with Kellen and Elias, expressions grave as she entered. "You received a threat," Damien said without preamble, rising from his seat as she walked in. "Just before your driver arrived," Mara confirmed, handing over her phone so he could read the message himself. His jaw tightened as he studied the screen, passing it silently to Kellen for further examination. "This confirms our suspicion," Elias said grimly. "Whoever arranged last night's attempt is aware their plan failed, and aware of your involvement specifically. That level of information moving this quickly suggests they have eyes somewhere close, perhaps even within the diner itself." Mara felt a fresh wave of unease at this possibility, imagining someone she might have served coffee to, someone whose face she might have smiled at, without ever suspecting their true purpose. "How do we find them?" she asked, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice, despite the fear still churning beneath it. Damien studied her carefully before answering, something like admiration flickering behind his composed expression. "We start by tracing every possible connection from last night, every message, every payment, every unfamiliar face near your workplace in recent weeks. And we make certain you're never left unprotected again until this threat is fully understood and eliminated." Kellen looked up from Mara's phone, his expression sharp with new information. The number used to send this message pinged briefly near the eastern edge of town before going dark. Whoever sent it wanted us to know how close they could get without being caught. The room fell into a tense silence, each person absorbing the weight of that revelation, the understanding that whoever orchestrated last night's near tragedy remained close enough to reach Mara whenever they chose, patient and confident enough to send a warning, rather than strike immediately. Damien finally broke the silence, his voice firm with quiet resolve. "Then we move faster than they expect. Elias, gather everything we have on recent enforcer hires along the eastern routes. Kellen, expand protection around Miss Ellison immediately, and coordinate with her uncle's household as well. Whoever is behind this wanted to send a message. Let's make sure our response arrives even faster, and far more decisively." The following 2 days passed in a strange blur of caution and forced normality for Mara, her shifts at the diner continuing, as though nothing had changed, while beneath the surface of her ordinary routine, an entire operation moved quietly to trace the source of the threat against her. Grace remained a steady, unobtrusive presence, parked nearby during Mara's shifts, and walking her home each night with quiet professionalism that gradually eased into something resembling friendship. Mara found herself grateful for the company, even as the reason behind it remained a constant, uneasy reminder of the danger still circling somewhere unseen. On the third evening, as Mara wiped down the counter near closing time, her phone buzzed with a message from Elias requesting she meet the group again once her shift ended. She agreed, though a familiar knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach at the thought of learning what new information they had uncovered. Grace drove her once more to the same modest building on the edge of town, where Damien, Kellen, and Elias waited, with expressions that carried both concern and cautious progress. Spread across the table between them lay printed documents, photographs, and what appeared to be transaction records, evidence of the careful investigation that had consumed the past several days. "We've made progress," Kellen began, gesturing for Mara to sit. "Victor Wren finally gave us a name, though reluctantly, and only after significant persuasion. He claims the intermediary who hired him goes by the name Derek Wallace, someone who has arranged similar work in the past for parties seeking to destabilize territorial alliances." "Do we know where to find him?" Mara asked, settling into the chair across from Damien. "We're working on it," Elias said. "Derek Wallace has proven difficult to trace directly, always using intermediaries and untraceable accounts. However, we did find something interesting. A pattern of financial transfers connecting to a small logistics company operating out of the Eastern District, one that has quietly expanded its influence over the past year." Damien leaned forward, his expression sharp with focused determination. "That logistics company has ties to a woman named Nora Whitfield, someone who has long opposed the unification of the territories under a single alliance. She believes fractured independent territories would better serve certain private interests that benefit considerably from instability and conflict." Mara absorbed this information carefully, feeling the shape of a much larger conspiracy settling into focus around her. "So this Nora Whitfield wanted you weakened, or removed entirely, to destabilize the alliance and create the kind of conflict that benefits her business." "Precisely," Kellen confirmed. "And if she was willing to risk an attempt on Damien's life directly, she won't hesitate to eliminate any loose thread that threatens to expose her involvement, which unfortunately includes you." The weight of that statement settled heavily over the room, and Mara found herself gripping the edge of the table slightly, steadying herself against the growing realization of just how deeply she had become entangled in a conflict far beyond her understanding only days earlier. "What's the plan?" she asked quietly. Damien exchanged a brief glance with Elias before answering. "We believe Nora Whitfield will attempt another move soon, likely once she confirms her first attempt has completely failed, and her hired hands have been captured. She won't want loose ends lingering, which means she may try something more direct, and potentially more dangerous, in the coming days." "You think she'll come after me directly?" Mara said, the words feeling strange and frightening as she spoke them aloud. "It's possible," Elias admitted honestly, "which is why we want to propose something that may feel uncomfortable, but could allow us to end this threat more quickly and permanently." Mara straightened slightly, bracing herself. "What kind of proposal?" Kellen spoke this time, his tone measured and careful. "We believe Nora Whitfield, or someone working closely with her, may attempt to approach you directly, perhaps disguised as a customer at the diner, or through some other seemingly innocent contact. If we can identify that approach in advance, prepared and protected, we may be able to trace it back to her directly, gathering enough evidence to expose her involvement conclusively." "You want to use me as bait," Mara said flatly, understanding the implication clearly despite the careful wording. The room fell silent for a moment, no one willing to soften the truth of the proposal any further. Finally, Damien spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "I would never ask this of you if I believed there was another equally effective option. But I want to be honest with you, rather than dress this in gentler words that hide the risk involved. If you agree, you would be protected at every moment, closely watched, with immediate intervention, the instant any threat became clear. But there would still be risk, and the decision must be entirely yours." Mara sat with the weight of that honesty for a long moment, appreciating it even as fear churned uncomfortably beneath her composed exterior. She thought of her uncle, of the quiet, ordinary life she had built in Ashwood Falls, a life that already felt distant and fragile compared to the danger now surrounding her. "If I say no," she asked carefully, "what happens then?" "Then we continue investigating through other channels," Elias said. "Slower, perhaps, but without placing you directly in harm's way. Your safety would remain a priority, regardless of your decision. Mara considered this, weighing the fear churning in her stomach against a growing, unexpected sense of resolve. She had already proven, without fully understanding the risk, that her instincts could make a difference in a moment that mattered. The idea of remaining passive now, waiting anxiously for danger to find her on its own terms, rather than facing it with preparation and support, felt somehow worse than the risk of participating directly. "I'll do it," she said finally, surprising even herself with the steadiness in her voice. "But I want to understand exactly what protection looks like, every detail, before I agree to anything further." Damien studied her for a long moment, something like quiet respect passing behind his calm brown eyes. "Then let's make sure you understand everything clearly, and let's make certain that whatever happens next, you remain as safe as we can possibly make you." Over the next hour, the group outlined a careful plan, discussing every possible scenario, every safeguard, every signal Mara could use if she sensed danger approaching before their own careful observation caught it first. Kellen arranged for additional guards to remain stationed discreetly near the diner during her shifts, while Grace would remain closer than ever, ready to intervene at the first sign of trouble. As the meeting drew to a close, Damien walked Mara to the door personally, his expression carrying a seriousness that softened slightly as he spoke his final words for the evening. "Thank you for trusting us with this," he said quietly. "I know this asks a great deal of you, more than anyone should reasonably expect from someone who simply wanted to work an evening shift in peace." Mara offered a small, tired smile. "I think somewhere along the way, my uncle's stories stopped feeling like just stories. Maybe some part of me has been waiting for a moment like this, without ever realizing it." Damien's expression shifted slightly at those words, something thoughtful passing behind his eyes, as he studied her with new consideration. "Whatever the reason, I'm grateful it led you to that diner counter on the exact night I needed someone paying close enough attention to notice what everyone else missed." As Mara stepped outside into the cool evening air, Grace waiting nearby to drive her home, she found herself reflecting on how quickly her life had transformed from ordinary routine into something far more uncertain and far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined only a handful of days earlier. 2 evenings later, Mara stood behind the diner counter, with her nerves stretched tight beneath a carefully practiced calm, aware that somewhere within sight, though carefully hidden, several of Damien's people watched every customer who walked through the door. Grace sat in a booth near the window, pretending to read a magazine, while another guard occupied a stool at the far end of the counter, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The evening passed slowly, ordinary customers coming and going without incident, and Mara began to wonder if perhaps tonight would pass like any other, the tension in her shoulders slowly easing, as the clock ticked closer to the end of her shift. Then, just after 8, the bell above the door rang, and a woman walked in alone, dressed simply, her expression pleasant and unremarkable in every way. She took a seat near the counter, glancing briefly at the menu before offering Mara a warm, easy smile. "Just coffee, please," the woman said, "and maybe a slice of whatever pie you'd recommend." Mara's heart began to pound, though she forced her expression to remain neutral, pouring the coffee with steady hands, despite the sudden tightness in her chest. She had memorized the description Kellen provided earlier, careful details about posture, mannerisms, the way Nora Whitfield reportedly tilted her head slightly when observing someone she found interesting. This woman matched none of those details specifically, yet something about her calm, watchful eyes made Mara's instincts prickle with familiar unease. "The cherry pie is popular tonight," Mara said, keeping her voice light and casual despite her racing pulse. "Perfect," the woman replied, still smiling pleasantly. "You know, you have a wonderful memory for customer preferences. I imagine that serves you well in this line of work." Something about the comment felt oddly pointed, though Mara could not immediately place why. She served the pie, glancing briefly toward Grace, who had lowered her magazine slightly, her attention now fully focused on the exchange unfolding at the counter. "Have I served you before?" Mara asked carefully, testing the waters. The woman's smile did not waver. "Not exactly, but I've heard quite a bit about you recently, about your keen sense of observation. It's rather remarkable, the kind of attention to detail you demonstrated a few nights ago." Mara's blood ran cold, understanding immediately that this conversation had moved far beyond casual pleasantries. She kept her hands steady as she wiped down the counter, buying herself a moment to gather her composure. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Of course you do," the woman said softly, her tone still pleasant, despite the clear threat lurking beneath her words. "You noticed something that night, something most people would have missed entirely. That kind of attention is admirable, truly. It's also, unfortunately, quite inconvenient for certain people." Grace rose smoothly from her booth, moving toward the counter with unhurried steps, though her eyes remained sharply focused on the woman seated there. Before she could reach them, however, the woman rose from her stool as well, setting a small folded piece of paper beside her half-finished pie. "I should be going," she said pleasantly, sliding payment across the counter along with a generous tip. "Do be careful, Miss Ellison. Attentive people sometimes attract attention they didn't ask for." She walked toward the door with unhurried calm, and Grace hesitated only a moment before following at a careful distance, speaking quietly into a small earpiece as she moved. Mara stood frozen behind the counter, staring at the folded paper the woman had left behind, her hands trembling as she finally reached out to open it. Inside, in neat, precise handwriting, were a series of numbers, an address, and a single line of text. "Come alone tonight, or the next attempt on the Alpha King will not fail." Mara's breath caught painfully in her throat as she read the words twice, understanding immediately the impossible position she had just been placed in. She glanced toward the door, where Grace had disappeared moments earlier, and reached for her phone with shaking hands, dialing Kellen's number immediately. "She left something," Mara said the moment he answered, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "An address, and a threat against Damien, if I don't come alone tonight." Kellen's voice sharpened instantly. "Don't move. We're already tracking her. Grace is following at a distance, and we'll have someone with you within minutes." "She said alone," Mara repeated, fear coiling tightly in her chest. "If she realizes I'm not alone, what if she carries through with the threat against Damien instead?" There was a brief, tense silence on the line before Kellen responded, his voice measured despite the urgency clearly building beneath it. "We'll handle this carefully, Mara. I promise you. Damien will not be left unprotected, and neither will you. Text me the address the moment you have privacy to do so, and stay exactly where you are until backup arrives." Mara ended the call and glanced around the diner, relieved to see Oliver occupied in the kitchen, unaware of the tension gripping the front counter. She read the address on the paper again, recognizing it as an abandoned warehouse district on the far edge of town, the kind of isolated location that offered little chance of interruption from ordinary passers-by. Within 15 minutes, Kellen arrived personally, accompanied by 2 additional guards, who entered the diner with careful, unhurried steps, blending seamlessly among the evening's remaining customers. He approached the counter quietly, taking the folded paper from Mara's hands and studying it with sharp, focused attention. "This is Nora Whitfield's handwriting," he confirmed grimly, "or someone working directly under her instruction. Either way, this confirms she's grown desperate enough to escalate rather than retreat." "What do we do?" Mara asked, her voice steadier now despite the fear still churning beneath the surface. Kellen considered the question carefully before answering. "We go to that address, but not alone, despite what her message demands. Damien would never allow you to walk into danger unprotected, and frankly, neither would I. We'll move carefully, ensure a strong presence surrounds the location without alerting her prematurely, and we bring this to a resolution tonight, one way or another." Damien arrived a short while later, having been informed of the situation the moment Kellen received Mara's call. His expression, usually composed and calm, carried a sharp edge of controlled anger as he studied the note himself, understanding immediately the depth of the threat now facing both Mara and himself directly. "She's grown reckless," he said quietly, "which makes her more dangerous, but also more likely to make a mistake we can use against her." "I have to go," Mara said firmly, surprising herself with the resolve in her own voice. "If I don't show up, she'll assume the threat against you is still active, and she may act on it regardless." Damien studied her for a long moment, clearly torn between the desire to protect her from further danger and the practical reality of the situation unfolding around them. "You won't go alone," he said finally. "We'll ensure you're never out of protected reach, even if it must remain hidden from her immediate view." As the group prepared to move, coordinating carefully with additional guards positioned discreetly around the warehouse district, Mara felt a strange, steady calm settle over her despite the danger awaiting them, a quiet resolve, born from the understanding that she had already proven herself capable of noticing what others missed, and trusting that same instinct now felt like the only path forward through the uncertainty ahead. The warehouse district sat quiet and dark beneath a sky heavy with clouds, rows of abandoned buildings casting long shadows across cracked pavement that had not seen regular use in years. Mara sat in the back seat of Grace's sedan as they approached, her heart pounding steadily despite the calm she forced into her expression, aware that somewhere close by, Damien and Kellen coordinated a careful approach designed to keep her protected without revealing their presence too soon. "Remember," Grace said quietly, as she parked a short distance from the designated address, "you're not walking in unprotected, even if it looks that way from where she's watching. The moment anything feels wrong, say the word we discussed, and we move immediately." Mara nodded, gripping the door handle with a steadiness she did not entirely feel. "I remember." She stepped out of the car alone, walking slowly across the empty lot toward the warehouse entrance, her footsteps echoing softly against the silence surrounding her. The building loomed ahead, a large metal door standing slightly ajar, faint light spilling out from somewhere deep within. She pushed the door open carefully, stepping into a space filled with old shipping containers and stacked crates, dim lighting hanging from exposed wiring overhead. At the far end of the warehouse, standing calmly beside a small table, was the same woman who had visited the diner earlier that evening, her pleasant smile now replaced with something colder, more calculating. "I'm glad you came alone," the woman said, though her eyes flicked briefly toward the entrance behind Mara, searching for any sign of company despite her words. "You didn't leave me much choice," Mara replied, keeping her voice steady, despite the fear coiling tightly in her chest. The woman studied her for a long moment, before speaking again. "My name is Nora Whitfield, since I imagine you've already guessed as much. I'll be direct with you, Miss Ellison, because I respect efficiency. You interfered with something that was carefully planned, and that interference has cost me considerably. You tried to poison him," Mara said, unable to keep the edge of anger from creeping into her voice despite her fear. "You could have killed him." Nora's expression remained unnervingly calm. "Weakened, not killed, though I understand why the distinction matters little to you. Damien Voss represents an alliance that threatens interests I have spent years building. His removal, or at least his significant weakening, would have created opportunities that benefit far more people than simply myself." "And now?" Mara asked, forcing herself to hold Nora's gaze, despite every instinct urging her to look away. "What happens now?" Nora studied her for a long, calculating moment before answering. "Now, I need to understand exactly how much you know, and exactly how much you've shared with Damien's people. Depending on your answers, we may be able to reach an arrangement that ensures your continued safety." Mara understood immediately that this was no genuine offer of safety, but rather an attempt to gauge how thoroughly her earlier warning had unraveled Nora's careful plans. She thought quickly, aware that stalling for time now mattered more than anything else, giving Damien and Kellen the opportunity to close in before the situation escalated further. "I know enough," Mara said carefully, "to understand that you're desperate enough to risk exposing yourself directly, which tells me your original plan has already failed completely." Something flickered behind Nora's calm expression, a brief crack in her composed exterior that confirmed Mara's words had struck closer to the truth than she expected. "Careful, Miss Ellison. Desperation makes people unpredictable, and unpredictability can be dangerous for everyone involved." Before Mara could respond, the warehouse door swung open behind her, and Damien stepped through, flanked closely by Kellen and several additional guards, who fanned out quickly to secure the surrounding space. Nora's expression hardened instantly, her earlier calm replaced by sharp, calculating awareness, as she realized her plan had already been anticipated. "You didn't come alone after all," Nora said coldly, addressing Damien directly now, rather than Mara. "Did you truly expect I would allow her to walk into danger unprotected?" Damien replied, his voice carrying the same commanding calm Mara had witnessed the very first night they met, though now tinged with barely restrained anger. "You've made a serious miscalculation tonight, Nora." Nora's eyes darted briefly toward the exits, though the guards positioned around the warehouse made any attempt at escape clearly futile. "I only wanted to understand what damage had been done," she said, her earlier confidence faltering slightly, under the weight of the situation now closing in around her. "You wanted to eliminate a witness," Kellen corrected sharply, and finish what your hired hands failed to accomplish days ago. Nora's composure finally cracked entirely. Frustration and fear flashing openly across her features, for the first time since Mara had encountered her at the diner counter. "The alliance you protect creates imbalance," she said, her voice rising with sudden intensity. "5 territories bound under a single authority removes independence, removes opportunity, for those who operate outside your rigid structure. I only sought to restore balance. By poisoning me and threatening an innocent woman who happened to notice your carefully hidden plan," Damien said, his tone icy despite its quiet control. "That isn't balance, Nora. That's simply violence, dressed in convenient justification." The tension in the warehouse stretched taut, every person present aware that the confrontation had reached its breaking point. Nora glanced once more toward the exits, calculating some final desperate option, before her shoulders sagged slightly, the fight visibly draining from her posture as she recognized the impossibility of her situation. "What happens now?" she asked quietly, echoing the very question Mara had asked her only moments earlier. "Now," Damien said firmly, "you answer for what you've done, before the Alliance Council, where your actions and their consequences will be judged according to the laws that govern us all. Laws you clearly believe did not apply to someone with enough resources and patience to work quietly from the shadows." Guards moved forward calmly, securing Nora without unnecessary force, her earlier defiance replaced now by resigned silence as she was led toward a waiting vehicle outside. Mara watched the scene unfold with a strange mixture of relief and lingering unease, the adrenaline of the past hour slowly beginning to fade as the danger that had loomed over her for days finally reached its resolution. Damien turned to her once the warehouse had emptied of guards and captive alike, his expression softening considerably as he studied her carefully, checking for any sign of harm, despite knowing she had remained protected throughout the encounter. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. Mara let out a long, shaky breath, feeling the tension of the past several days finally begin to release from her shoulders. "I think so," she said, "though I imagine it will take a while before tonight fully sinks in." "You handled yourself remarkably well," Damien said, genuine admiration clear in his voice. "Better than many trained guards would have managed under similar pressure." Mara offered a small, tired smile. "I think I had good motivation, and a very persuasive uncle who spent years teaching me to trust my instincts, even when I didn't fully understand why." Damien's expression grew thoughtful as he studied her, something warmer settling behind his calm brown eyes. "Perhaps it's time I met this uncle of yours properly, given how significantly his lessons have shaped the events of the past week." As they walked together toward the waiting vehicles outside, the warehouse behind them finally quiet and empty, Mara felt the last of her fear begin to settle into something closer to relief, understanding that whatever came next, the immediate danger that had shadowed her since that strange, tense evening at the diner counter had finally, truly come to an end. A week passed before life in Ashwood Falls began to feel ordinary again, though Mara found that the definition of ordinary had shifted considerably since the night she first overheard a strange phrase about sugar over coffee that had never been ordered with any at all. Nora Whitfield had been taken before the Alliance Council, and though Mara was not present for the proceedings, Kellen later informed her that the evidence gathered proved more than sufficient to hold her fully accountable for the attempted attack and the subsequent threats made against Mara directly. The logistics company connected to her operations had been dismantled, and the quiet instability she hoped to sow among the territories had instead resulted in stronger cooperation between the alliance leaders, unified further by the shared understanding of just how close they had come to losing their leader entirely. Mara returned to her shifts at the diner, though she noticed small changes that lingered even after the danger had passed. Grace still stopped by occasionally, no longer as a silent guardian, but as something closer to a genuine friend, sharing coffee and quiet conversation during slow evening hours. Oliver had eventually pieced together enough of the story to understand that something significant had happened, though he respected Mara's privacy enough not to press for details she wasn't ready to share. On a quiet Thursday evening, as the dinner rush wound down and the diner settled into its familiar late-night calm, the bell above the door rang once more, and Mara looked up to see Damien walking in alone, dressed far more casually than she had ever seen him before, without the usual entourage of guards trailing carefully behind him. She set down the coffee pot she had been holding and offered him a small, genuine smile as he approached the counter. "This is unexpected," she said. "No Kellen? No Elias?" Damien returned her smile, settling onto one of the counter stools, with an ease that felt different from the tense, watchful presence he had carried during their earlier encounters. "I thought it might be nice to visit without quite so much ceremony surrounding it," he said. "Consider it an attempt to simply be a customer, for once." Mara laughed softly, pouring him a cup of coffee, without needing to ask how he preferred it. "No sugar," she said, sliding the cup toward him. "Though I imagine you'll understand if I check twice before serving you anything from now on." Damien chuckled, the sound warm and unguarded in a way that surprised her, given how composed and serious he had remained throughout every previous encounter. "A habit I imagine will serve us both well," he said. They talked for a while, the conversation drifting easily between lighter topics, Mara sharing small stories about her years working at the diner, Damien offering glimpses into a life she still found difficult to fully imagine, one filled with responsibility and constant vigilance, though tonight, at least, he seemed determined to set that weight aside for a few quiet hours. "How is your uncle?" Damien asked eventually, genuine curiosity evident in his tone. "Enjoying himself far too much," Mara admitted with a small smile. "Elias visited him last week, and the two of them spent hours trading old stories. I think it's the most animated I've seen my uncle in years." Damien's expression warmed further at this. Elias mentioned as much. He seemed genuinely pleased to reconnect with someone who understood the world he came from so thoroughly. Mara studied Damien for a moment, curiosity finally overtaking her hesitation. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why do you keep coming back here? You've thanked me, more than generously, and the danger has passed. You don't need to keep visiting a small diner on the edge of town." Damien considered the question seriously before answering, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup thoughtfully. "I suppose I could offer several practical reasons. Checking on your continued safety, ensuring the aftermath of everything settled properly. But honestly, Mara, I think I simply enjoy your company. You speak to me plainly, without the careful deference most people offer someone in my position. It's rather refreshing." Mara felt an unexpected warmth rise in her chest at his words, something she hadn't quite expected to feel, given the circumstances that had brought them together in the first place. "I suppose saving someone's life tends to remove a bit of the usual formality," she said lightly, though the sincerity beneath her words was unmistakable. "Perhaps," Damien agreed, his eyes holding hers with quiet warmth. "Though I think it's more than that. You noticed something no one else did. Not because you were trained to look for danger, but because you paid genuine attention to the world around you. That kind of quality is rare and valuable, far beyond the events of that single evening." Mara considered his words carefully, understanding the weight behind them extended beyond simple gratitude. "What are you saying exactly?" Damien hesitated only briefly, before answering honestly. "I'm saying that I would like to continue knowing you, Mara Ellison, beyond the circumstances that first brought us together. Not out of obligation, or lingering concern for your safety, but simply because I find myself genuinely wanting to." The sincerity in his voice left little room for misunderstanding, and Mara found herself smiling, despite the flutter of nervous uncertainty accompanying his words. "I think I'd like that too," she admitted, "though I imagine my life will never quite return to the simple routine it once was, regardless of how this unfolds." "Perhaps not," Damien agreed, "but I'd like to think that isn't entirely a loss. Sometimes the most meaningful changes in our lives arrive precisely when we least expect them, often disguised as ordinary moments that later reveal themselves to be anything but." As the evening wound down and Damien eventually rose to leave, promising to return again soon, Mara found herself reflecting on how dramatically her world had shifted since that tense, strange night weeks earlier. She had gone from an ordinary waitress paying careful attention to strangers in a quiet diner booth, to someone standing at the edge of an entirely different world, one filled with danger, responsibility, and now, unexpectedly, the beginnings of something she had never anticipated finding at all. Months passed, and the small diner on the edge of Ashwood Falls remained largely unchanged, its worn counters and familiar hum of quiet conversation continuing much as they always had. Yet within that same steady routine, Mara Ellison had become someone different from the woman who once poured coffee, without a second thought about the world hidden just beyond her ordinary awareness. She still worked her shifts, still smiled politely at strangers passing through for a late-night meal, but she carried herself now with a quiet confidence that had not existed before, the kind born from surviving something dangerous and emerging with newfound understanding of her own strength. Grace remained a close friend, often stopping by, even when official business no longer required her presence, and Oliver had long since stopped questioning the occasional unfamiliar face that lingered a little too carefully near the counter, understanding, without needing full explanation, that some things in Mara's life now existed beyond simple curiosity. Her Uncle Peter had taken to visiting the Alliance Council occasionally, his old expertise proving valuable in ways he had not expected to matter again after so many quiet years of retirement. He often joked that Mara had somehow managed to pull him back into a world he thought he had left behind for good, though the pride in his voice whenever he spoke of her made clear he held no genuine complaint about it. Damien visited the diner regularly now, sometimes alone, sometimes accompanied by Kellen or Elias, though the tension that once accompanied his presence had softened considerably into something far more comfortable. Their conversations had deepened over the months, evolving from cautious gratitude into genuine friendship, and eventually into something neither of them had expected to find in a quiet diner booth on an otherwise unremarkable evening. On a cool autumn evening, as the last light faded beyond the diner windows, Damien arrived once more, though this time he did not settle onto his usual stool at the counter. Instead, he waited near the door until Mara finished with her final customer of the evening, watching her with a quiet warmth that had become familiar over the preceding months. "You look like you have something on your mind," Mara observed, wiping down the counter as Oliver called out a farewell from the kitchen before heading home for the night. "I do, actually," Damien admitted, stepping closer. "I wanted to speak with you about something important, away from the usual pretense of simply stopping by for coffee." Mara set down her cloth, giving him her full attention, curiosity mingling with the familiar warmth she always felt in his presence now. "All right, I'm listening." Damien took a steadying breath before continuing. "The Alliance Council has taken formal notice of everything that happened these past months. Not only the danger you helped prevent, but the courage and clarity you demonstrated throughout every difficult moment that followed. They've asked that I extend a formal invitation, offering you a recognized position, advising on matters of observation and awareness, drawing on the very instincts that first brought us together." Mara blinked in surprise, the offer settling slowly over her as she considered its full weight. "Me? Advising the Alliance Council?" "You," Damien confirmed, a small encouraging smile touching his lips. "Your uncle has already agreed to support you through the transition, sharing his own experience to help guide you should you choose to accept. But this decision, like every decision since that first night, belongs entirely to you." Mara considered the offer carefully, memories flooding back through the months of danger, uncertainty, and eventual understanding that had led her to this exact moment. She thought of the ordinary life she once lived, content within its familiar boundaries, and the extraordinary path that had unfolded since the night she chose to trust her instincts rather than remain silent. "I think," she said slowly, a smile beginning to form as clarity settled over her thoughts. "I'd like to accept, though I hope that doesn't mean giving up this diner entirely. Some part of me still feels most like myself standing right here, behind this counter." Damien's smile widened warmly at her answer. "I would never ask you to give up the place where everything began, Mara. If anything, I think it serves as a rather fitting reminder of exactly why your perspective matters so much." Mara stepped out from behind the counter, joining him near the door as the evening settled fully into night outside the diner windows. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for seeing something in me worth trusting, even before I fully understood it myself." "Thank you," Damien replied gently, "for noticing danger nobody else did, and having the courage to speak up when silence would have been so much easier." They stepped outside together into the cool evening air, the quiet town of Ashwood Falls stretching peacefully around them, unaware of just how much one ordinary waitress's careful attention had changed the course of an entire alliance's future. Mara glanced back once at the familiar glow of the diner windows, a warm, steady reminder of the life she had built, before turning forward toward whatever new chapter awaited her next, ready this time to meet it with open eyes and steady resolve.